Hi there, my name is Jordan LaMothe. I'm going to show you today how I make my faceted Western chef knife handles. So these are, when I say Western handles, it means handles that have a curvy profile rather than the straight Japanese ones. And we're going to do a rather straightforward octagon cross-section handle. So the trick with any handle is to keep it straight and symmetrical as you're shaping it. And that means that you want to start with something that's relatively straight. So I have my blade completely ground, and right now the handle is, the profile is all established, but it's square in cross-section, or rectangular in cross-section everywhere. The most important part about what I've done here, other than of course nice symmetrical grinding, is that the back, the spine of the knife is totally flat and square, so that if I put it on my surface plate, it stands up 90 degrees to the block. This is really important because it's going to help us with layout of the facets and the ridges later on. The first thing I'm going to do before removing any material is find the center of the handle. So the surface plate is indispensable for this. I have just a piece of cold rolled bar stock, and I'm going to set the blade on that. Obviously, if you have a 1, 2, 3 block and a height gauge, those are going to be more accurate than my setup here, but this is good enough for what we're doing. I've made a little mark with a Sharpie to make sure that I line this up at the same place every time, which is important because there's a distal taper in the blade that will throw off your lines if this block isn't always in the same position. Then I have a pencil that's just shimmed up to approximately the middle of the knife block, and I'm going to scribe the line around. Okay, so now that that line is scribed, I'm going to flip it over. I'm going to make sure that I line up the block at the same Sharpie mark and scribe my second line. So now I have a line that's parallel with the blade. Well, two lines, but we know that those two lines are equidistant from the center line. And now I'm actually going to do the same thing at a lower height, so that I have some more guidelines to use. All right, so that's our set of lines, and that will tell, we always want to make sure that as we're working in this dimension of the knife, which is the kind of the first step of the shaping, that everything is always equidistant from those guidelines. I start by tapering the handle from bolster to butt. This footage is sped up, but I'm really taking my time to make sure that these new planes that I'm creating are symmetrical. These are the foundation for all of the rest of the handle shaping that we'll do on this knife. So the tapering on this handle is started, not totally finished yet. You can see that I've just started to hit the front of the bolster with the grinder. I know that these two planes of the bolster are flat because I ground them that way, so those are really important references to make sure that these planes, the new planes that I'm creating, are symmetrical. Back to the grinder. You can see from those sparks that now I'm grinding both the wood and metal together. I'm working with a sharp 60 grit ceramic belt on a glass platen. I'm paying attention to the transitions between the unground and ground surfaces on the bolster, making sure that the transition line is symmetrical on either side. So I've ground until there's just barely a hint of the previous flat parallel bolster left. And so now there's a nice gradual taper to the entire handle, and this will set up the geometry. It's important to look to verify that your lines are right, because ultimately the eye needs to make the last decision whether it's straight or not. So I want to add a little bit of waist to the handle. So instead of having an even taper, I wanted to taper and then to get a little bit narrower before flaring back out. And so in my head, I know that when I have a plane here meeting another plane, there's going to be some line that's the transition. And I want that line to be symmetrical from side to side. You can just gently clamp it in a vise. Make sure that the knife is centered, and trace that line on both sides. It doesn't need to be your final, this doesn't need to be your final layout line. You don't need to grind exactly to it, but it gives you a reference for grinding that next portion. I start by tapering the profile on the butt of the knife. These tapers that I grind in will help guide my wheel when I go in to grind in that gentle sway that I want in the handle. Now I can use the small wheel to loft between that reference line that I drew for the ridge and the profile that I just ground on the butt of the knife. I'm making gentle passes on the wheel, paying attention to move smoothly in and out and never linger in one spot where the wheel will have a tendency to dig into the handle. Now I'm refining my curves using the corner of the platen, where I find it easier to control the angle and also easier to see my guidelines. After roughing out this still rectangular handle with a 60 grit ceramic belt, I went over everything with a 220 grit belt, and you can see that I've now ground all the way to the edge of the bolster so that it's a totally smooth transition now on both sides. The finer grinder scratches make it a little bit easier to see the geometry. Here I'm using 400 grit sandpaper on a narrow sanding stick to really refine the curvature in the handle. I've really spent a lot of time trying to get it as close to perfect as I possibly can. You're going to have to do it at some point, and it's a little bit easier to do it right now before the additional facets are in. There's also the added benefit that you're not doing it all at once at the very end, so it makes that a little bit faster. So the next thing we're going to do is grind off all these corners so that it's an octagon. Using my pencil shimmed on some blocks and a surface plate, I've created what you can see this kind of grid of lines on both sides, and those are my references. I also have still the lines that go parallel to that center line. I'll start with the angled facets on the spine side. I'm sighting down the blade to make sure that the angle I use is the same on either side. Now I'm working on the angled facets on the underside of the handle, starting from the bolster and moving my way up the handle. It's important to work the metal first and then to work the wood down to the metal. Notice when I'm working on the bolster to handle transition, the corner of the platen never leaves the metal. It's always grinding both metal and wood at the same time, never just the wood.
use the 2-inch wheel to rough in the facets on the back half of the handle. Then I can clean up those curved facets using the corner of the platen. Grinder ergonomics are important to keeping your grind symmetrical, and I find I get best results when I pay attention to how I'm moving my body on one side and try to replicate that as accurately as possible on the other side.
So I ground in the bevels on each corner with a 60 grit belt, and now I'm going to move to a 220 grit belt to really clean them up and refine the geometry. Notice that dealing with this transition here, I carried these facets all the way down onto the very end of the heel. I always think that that looks nice. It's a nice kind of flow that it creates. So for final refining the geometry and polishing the handle, I'm going to use a 320 grit J-Flex belt that's a little bit worn, which is actually a good thing because it makes a slightly finer surface. Then I have this felt backed platen. It's just a soft backer, and that helps get rid of any belt bump. Whenever that seam runs over a hard platen, it will create unnecessary motion, and I'm running at a very, very slow speed.
Now I work over all of the surfaces on the handle with this finer belt. I'm trying to remove all of the scratches from the coarser grits, and I'm also refining the shape of the handle. With this fine belt, you can't remove much material, but you have a lot of control to push the lines and ridges ever so slightly to perfect the symmetry. When grinding metal and wood at the same time, the same principles apply as with a coarser belt. So when I'm working on this transition, I'm careful not to let the belt leave the metal surface. I'm grinding both at the same time, applying a little extra pressure on the metal. Also notice that I'm positioning the handle on the grinder as close to vertical as I can. This also helps to avoid any undercutting of the wood, and it gives more control over the facet angle. To grind the tighter curves on the underside of the handle, I run the belt slightly over the edge of the platen and let that soft backer conform to the handle as I work around the corner. I make sure to take the knife off the grinder frequently to look at it, check the symmetry, make sure that I haven't gone too far. And here I'm grinding the side facets vertically on the platen.
So at this point, the whole handle's been ground to a dull 320 grit belt. So at this point, you could go in with probably 600 grit sandpaper and clean things up. I'm going to go a step finer and use a really dull 400 grit belt. Grit doesn't matter so much at this stage because that really dull belt is mostly just going to burnish and kind of clean up the wood and steel, and hopefully then I won't have to do much hand sanding. I find that my edges are cleanest when they come off the grinder, and sanding by hand tends to round them ever so slightly, and I usually try to avoid that. Little 220 grit mark in the corner in here, and I just want to polish that out because that's going to be a real pain to do with a hand sanding, but if I get it out with the belt, I won't have to worry about it.
finish grinding is a very slow process. It usually takes a couple of hours, and it's not very interesting to watch on video, so I've tried to show you a couple of the different positions in which I hold the knife on the grinder, but you'll have to try it yourself if you want to get the full duration experience.
Finishing these concave portions of the handle is usually a combination of hand sanding and grinder work for me. So I'm going over with 600 grit paper to clean up this transition in here. And I may go back to the grinder a bit as well with that dull 400 grit belt to kind of just polish things up before moving on to really fine sandpaper.
The sanding stick I'm using is a half round, so it's flat on one side and round on the other, and it's just a piece of wood.
So here's the handle as it was finished on the dull 400 grit belt with a little bit of hand sanding on this surface. And now I need to address the back face of this handle because it's still flat straight across. So what I want to do is create just a little bit of a dome that just makes it a little easier on the eye. So I'll take it off the handle and grind in a very, very slight dome. I'm going to draw a little guideline, just using my finger as a guide. Make sure it's symmetrical side to side.
There's not much material to remove, so I'm roughing it in with a 220 grit belt. I start by grinding steep facets down to the guidelines on either side, making sure to keep them symmetrical. Then I will grind subsequent facets moving toward the center, working symmetrically on each side.
So you can see a little better what I'm doing. I've drawn with pencil on the back of the handle, and as I grind that away, you'll see how that space disappears. Usually this area for integrals under the choil of the knife takes quite a bit of hand cleanup for me, done with 600 grit sandpaper usually. If I find that there's something that is slightly out of symmetry, I'll go back to the grinder, and I'm seeing right now that there's a little more material on the close side than the far side. So I want to take it back to the grinder on a fine belt and just walk that back. It's not worth trying to do that by hand.
Once I'm satisfied with the geometry of the handle, then I can go and round the spine. It's an important step for the functionality of the knife because if that spine is sharp, it's going to be very uncomfortable to use in a pinch grip. But I always leave this step to the very end because those sharp corners make it easier to see whether the blade is straight and in line with the handle. As soon as the spine is polished, I'll be ready to etch the blade and bring out the Damascus pattern.
I've now etched the blade and assembled the knife, so it's all glued together. And now the last thing I need to do is dress this face.
I use a hacksaw and a file to remove the excess material. on the nut rather than using a grinder, because the heat from the grinder could easily burn the wood, melt the epoxy, and cause other issues with the handle. File keeps everything cool.
I switched to a finer file. That was a 0 cut file. This is a number 2 cut file. Just filing it down until I get to the wood. And back to the dull 320 grit belt on the soft platen. And here I took the platen off entirely, just for the final kind of smoothing passes. I'm taking care to preserve a crisp edge around the very end of the knife handle. The last thing to do is to just gently chamfer or round these corners. I'm using a piece of 1000 grit sandpaper here. It doesn't take much. The corners tend to be pretty fragile, and rounding them will make them a little bit stronger. But it also, you can easily get carried away. So don't. Sometimes a very fine file works well too for this particular job. So I gently chamfered all of these corners here. You can barely see it, which is exactly what I want, because it still reads as a crisp line to the naked eye. It looks clean in design, but then there's just a slight radius or bevel on the edge there. So I'm going to mask off this bolster area and buff the handle, and hopefully it'll be finished. Sometimes the buffing will bring out little bits of geometry that need to be tweaked, and then you can kind of go in and adjust again. I'm using white scratchless compound on a loose sewn muslin wheel, which should be really gentle. You want to be careful not to round these corners too much. A little rounding is okay. It'll make it feel a little bit more comfortable in the hand. But if you round them too much, they won't read as these nice crisp lines, which is the whole reason we made the facets in the first place.
You always need to be careful when using a buffer, because that soft wheel will tend to catch any hard edge that you put into it. So I'm making sure that any sharp corners that are on the handle are pointed downward, away from the spinning of the wheel. This part makes me nervous to watch, but I know that I'm being extra careful not to catch that top corner of the handle in the buffing wheel.
So here it is off the buffer. It turned out that some of these lines in here weren't quite as crisp or as symmetrical as I wanted. So I actually spent an hour or two just cleaning those up with some sandpaper. But now I think it's good enough. So I'm going to rub some tongue oil on the handle just to kind of take out. It helps to kind of remove some of the extra buffing compound, and put a nice sealant finish on the wood.
And then I can unmask this blade so you can see it in all its finished glory.